Now, like many countries in Africa, Nigeria has wrestled with how to redefine itself in its post-colonial era. As the country enters its 60th year since independence from Britain, there are growing calls for a national name change. It's an attempt to scrub out vestiges of the past and to show that Nigeria is serious about ditching at least part of its odious colonial history by changing the country's name. But such a move has expectedly become controversial, with some suggesting that changing the country's name is a purely superficial act with no intrinsic value, while others have called it treason. But supporters of name change say they will take the battle to the National Assembly in an effort to amend the Constitution. Here's one such prominent proponent speaking as far back as 2014 about the benefits of changing Nigeria's name.
Born in 1960, but I heard of Dr. Kalu Ezera, who had suggested in 1960 that Nigeria should change to Songhai, because you know the great empires in West Africa, you had Guinea, you had Ghana, you had Mali, and then you had Songhai. Nkrumah, on the 6th of March 1957, changed the colonial name of Gold Coast to Ghana and focused the attention of Ghanaians on the new entity. Unfortunately, the leadership of Nigeria at independence was not that far-sighted to even recognize that Flora Shaw, the girlfriend of Lord Lugard, could not give us a name, because the cognomen of Nigeria is derived from the Latin nigr. Nigr is black. It is from nigr that we got Negro. And now, in fact, the racists now call us niggers. So, in fact, it was a derisive name to give us, nigger area. And every time I see Nigerian athletes at international athletic meetings, and they wear tags saying NGR, it reminds me of nigger. And if even in America, where rednecks, racists are now afraid to use what is called the N-word, you don't say nigger anymore in today's world. And it's still, for me, antithetical to our pride. And as the world's largest concentration of black people, to be using that epithet of Nigeria. Songhai has some relationship with Nigeria. So I thought we could actually start rediscovering Nigeria by changing the name and all the bad things that have been associated with Nigeria. Nigeria is not a name that I'm proud of, which, as I say, does damage and violence to our worth, you know, as Africans. Even those who think that River Niger is the name from which the country took its own description will be shocked to realize that the traditional people did not call that river Niger. They call it Kwara. Kwara was the name given by the natives to what the people like Mungo Park and the Batin brothers or the Landa brothers suggested. You know what? When we were in primary school, we were taught that Mungo Park discovered the River Niger. But I tell my own students now that it's River Niger that discovered Mungo Park. So quite sincerely, 54 years after banning the name Niger area, I think the time was right for us to depart from the iniquity of Lord Lugard and his girlfriend and create a new nation for ourselves.
This controversial topic. I'm joined now from our Lagos studios by the man you just saw in that clip, Dr. Akin Oke Everday, who until recently was a professor of international jurisprudence at the University of Lagos and was a delegate at the 2014 National Conference, where the issue of name change and restructuring were discussed. And with me here in the Abuja studio, Ambassador Humphrey Ojiako, retired ambassador and Nigeria's former permanent representative representative to the United Nations in Geneva, who has written a book titled Nigeria, the Forsaken Road to Nationhood and Development, in which he insistently calls for Nigeria to be politically restructured, and by the international journalist and African affairs analyst Lindsay Barrett. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And I'm going to go straight away to Lagos and start with you, Professor Akin Oke Everday. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join us. And I just want to know if your position has changed at all, because that clip we saw of you was from 2014, immediately after you introduced the idea of a name change to the National Conference at the time. Have you changed your position, or are you still fairly insistent that Nigeria ought to change its name?
Not at all. My belief is that a change of name will give us a new lease of life. We have carried that tag around for so long, despite the fact that it's one of discrimination, self-discrimination, and self-immolation. Just like I said many years back, that the genius of Kwame Nkrumah discovered Ghana as a replacement, a worthy replacement for the Gold Coast. I believe it's better late than never for Nigeria to rediscover itself. I saw a map in Boston University, African Studies Center, a map of Africa, and the western coast of Africa was described in various ways, named after the products that lay in the hinterland. You had the grain coast, you had the Ivory Coast, you had the Gold Coast, and then you had what they call the Slave Coast. I don't need to belabor the point that what you call Nigeria supplied the bulk of the slaves to the New World. So if Nkrumah had changed the name of Gold Coast to Ghana, and Ivory Coast still retains its own name, there's no Grain Coast, which was to describe Guinea, I think the leadership role that Nigeria enjoys within the black race merits the notion of a change in nomenclature, so that when you say Songhai or whatever name we prefer, that would be easy to associate with the largest concentration of black people in the world. But to continue calling ourselves a nigger area, as I said, is self-abuse, and is something that Nigeria has to depart from.
Okay, Dr. Oke Everday, please stay with us. I will come back to you in a moment, but let me talk to Ambassador Humphrey Ojiako, who's in the studio here with Lindsay Barrett along with me. Given that the name ambassador, as we heard there, has been interpreted by some as being regressive, and seeing that it's related, or certainly it's suggested that it's related in some way to the derogatory term nigger, should the name Nigeria be changed, or is it just old wine in new skin and changes nothing?
Thanks for bringing me here on this subject. Let me say upfront that Nigeria needs to be reset. I don't think what else Nigeria is its name. Nigeria has a lot of problems, many of them political, economic, and social problems. And we should not be that lazy to challenge them. If I have a pet dog, and I call it Jack, or I call it Tiger, or I call it Jackal, it is still a dog. A dog is a dog, no matter what you call it. So this thing about black and being, queasy about the name black, assuming Nigeria was a country that was doing so very well in science and technology, doing very well economically among the leading countries of the world, would we really be worrying what anybody calls us?
Yeah, but the fact is that it isn't. And therefore, the argument is that if you renew the name, you begin the process of renewing the spirit as well.
That sounds like the thing I hear about Hamitic hypothesis. We are cursed. Maybe the reason we're not doing well is because our name is not good. I cannot begin to subscribe to that kind of belief system. The fact is, if we reset Nigeria, if we restructure Nigeria in a way to answer the national question, and that national question has been raging since independence, and we've been so shy to address it. Nobody's ready to face it. We speak about it. Today you hear things like Amotekun in the southwest. You hear all kinds of things coming from different zones of the country. It is all clamoring for the same thing. We want a certain loose kind of union where people could begin to do things for themselves, take responsibility for their own fate to a certain degree, while at the center, you have a government that moderates things, that takes care of those aspects of our lives that need to unify, that need to bring us together. That is not happening. And to me, and to many people who believe in Nigeria, that is where our problem lies.
Okay, let me bring Lindsay Barrett in, who has both an internal and external perspective. What difference will a name change make?
Well, Charles, Professor Ibode's point is well taken when we look at the historic circumstances that he mentions. And his suggestion that the name Songhai would be an ideal name for Nigeria is very interesting, and especially I wish it had come up at the time of the argument for independence, because Ghana, Zimbabwe, they all chose their names.
Well, actually, Dr. Akinbode made the point, Oyebode made the point that Professor Ezera suggested that at independence.
It before, but it had not become a popular issue. And that is the important thing now, Charles. 60 years after independence, the name change will have to be given popular justification. You'll need a referendum to make it legitimate. Yes, you can't just take it to the House of Reps and say.
Right.
So it's going to be a work in progress. Yes. As Nigeria itself, as the ambassador says, is a work in progress.
But then so would be restructuring. I mean, you were going to restructure the country, you'd have to do a lot.
It would have such a suggestion if it became part of a popular movement.
Right.
Allied to restructuring, to much deeper restructuring, then we would think about it.
There are growing calls for Nigeria to change its name as a way of getting rid of at least part of its colonial legacy and giving its people the chance to choose a new identity for themselves. But the issue is raising more questions than answers, along with a fair amount of political bickering. Beyond that, of course, any suggestion of a name change for Nigeria would have to meet a legal threshold, such as possibly a referendum, and a debate would have to be held in the National Assembly ahead of a constitutional amendment. The outcome of such a move is unclear, especially with many politicians holding fast that a name change amounts to a betrayal of trust, a breach of faith, and a violation of allegiance to the Nigerian state. But still, supporters insist that a name change is the best way forward for Nigeria and is only a first step that should lead to a further negotiation of Nigeria's unity. So what do ordinary Nigerians make of the idea of a name change? Well, we took to the streets of Abuja to find out.
To be very honest with you, I don't think changing the name will solve any problem. If we really want to go into deep on how to solve Nigerian problems, shouldn't be like changing our names. Because one thing is to change the name, the another thing is that have we changed our mindset? We need to change our mindset, our orientation, how we think about the country itself. Then we should be thinking of what we can give to the country, not what we can take from the country, you see. So changing the name, from my own point of view, changing the name doesn't really mean anything.
I prefer we talking about how to make things work in the country than deliberating on changing name of Nigeria to, I don't know the name you want us to change it to. But for me, Nigeria, it would be better if it's one country, not divided or not talking about this one on his own and this one on his own. So it's preferable if we restructure things, make things better, than talking about changing name.
I believe names matters and all that, but still though, that's not the big problem. The big problem is the government, not the name. In as much as name follows you and the meaning of your name matters also, I still think the problem, what we need to change mostly is our government, not name.
I love the name, so I don't think there's any need. If a change wants to be carried out in the country, it mustn't be with the name. You know, there are other things we should focus on, not the name. The name is, I'm cool with the name. So we should focus more on other stuffs like human trafficking, drugs and other things, not the name. The name doesn't really matter. It's not going to change anything. It won't really matter to some people. It's Nigeria that it's Nigeria, even if you change it to anything.
And that's a cross-section of people on the streets of Abuja there. And of course, the person conducting the interview with those people was our producer, Nisi Gabriel. And with me from our Lagos studios, Dr Akin Oke Everday, who until recently was a professor of international jurisprudence at the University of Lagos and was a delegate at the 2014 National Conference where the issue of name change and restructuring were discussed. And with me here in the Abuja studio, Ambassador Humphrey Ojiako, retired ambassador and Nigeria's former permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva, who's written a book titled Nigeria, The Forsaken Road to Nationhood and Development, in which he calls for the country to be politically restructured, and the international journalist and African affairs analyst, Lindsay Barrett. Gentlemen, thank you for staying with us. And let me go to you, Dr Akin Oke Everday in Lagos there. You heard a cross-section of Nigerians on the streets of Abuja talking about their sort of consideration for whether the name of Nigeria should be changed or not. Is it your sense that the main issue that Nigeria faces is a name change?
No, it's not an issue of the primary concern or the primary issue confronting Nigeria. I would suggest that there must be a dialectical relationship between form and content. So if we want to revisit the complexion of Nigeria as a country in terms of attaining what is called a true federalist system, I think a complement of such a move, and a welcome one at that, would be a change of identity. For too long, the word Nigeria had been associated with very negative sentiments, so much so that not many people are anxious to be identified as Nigerians. But when you have an African name like Songhai or whatever we choose to call ourselves, that will remove the hubris of the colonial tag that we have been banding around for the last 60 years at least. So I'm still very much convinced that the time has come for Nigeria to take charge of its destiny. I understand the misgivings of the ordinary people on the streets. I recall that when we were at the confab, and I made that suggestion in my opening statement to the confab, my daughter, who was away in the United States, called me up and said, "Daddy, what is Songhai?" So she really did not understand what I had in mind. And I said, if you are a lawyer and you are pursuing master's program at UPenn, and I have to convince you of the necessity for a name change, then we have a problem on our hands. As I told the conferees at Abuja, it wasn't really my idea. Dr. Kalu Ezera, who had come to Nigeria with a background from Harvard and from UPenn, as well as Oxford, really thought he would make a difference. But just like myself, he was laughed to scorn in 1960. But I think 60 years later, let us launch a new Nigeria with the change of name and hoping that there will be something to associate with, to be proud of in what we now call ourselves. When you say Nigeria, outside Nigeria, other people, other Africans, and even Europeans,
right.
Yes, they don't enjoy the nomenclature that we use.
Okay, well, to be fair, Professor Oyebode, I mean, a lot of people are not laughing what you're saying off. There's actually quite considerable support for your position amongst Nigerian people. But let me bring Ambassador Ojiako in, because if, for instance, and I know that your position is that this is not the priority, but if Nigerians agree to change the name, what would the country's new name be? What would you suggest? Would it be Songhai? Some people have said Wazobia. There's quite a lot of discussion on this on the internet. Somebody has said Niger. Some even suggested malaria, which is, I mean, a fairly perverse suggestion, but, you know, it's quite extraordinary, really.
Since at the moment, until I'm persuaded differently.
Right, you don't even want to consider the possibility.
I couldn't even think about that. But I could say something about names and changes that are cosmetic. Sometime in the past, I think in the 70s, we changed our national anthem from Nigeria we held it to Arise, O Compatriots. And the argument at the time was quite similar to what I'm hearing now. Oh, this will elevate our spirits, it will make people think differently about Nigeria and all of that. And so many decades later, look at where we are. I don't see what these cosmetic changes would bring. If we are talking about dissociating with, say, colonial heritage of the name, only a few days ago, our president, among some other African heads of state, just came back from England. So many African leaders being, you know, in a conference with one British prime minister and stuff like that. And they are making us promises.
Absolutely.
So why is that happening? If those are the real substances. Why are we going to England to get things we could do for ourselves here easily? Those are the things we want to address. And I think we owe it to the new generation of Nigerians to say this is substance, and this substance we should pursue it. To me, things like name change are distractionary. They tend to take us away lead us away from the many issues which are confronting Nigeria.
Okay, let me bring Lindsay Barrett in, because Lindsay, the argument in opposition to what Ambassador Ojiako is saying is that restructuring is a process, and you begin that process by properly identifying yourself. And then once you do that, you begin to orient the minds of the people towards change.
Charles,
and that sort of change is the more fundamental restructuring.
One thing I want to say, for several generations, since 1914, several generations of Africans around the basin of the Kwara River have called themselves Nigerians. The sentiments that you hear on the street are not frivolous. You cannot put them away. Nigerians believe they are Nigerians. And even when they criticize themselves, and I can tell you that Nigerians are among the most self-critical Africans I have met. Even when they criticize themselves, they talk about the hope for a better Nigeria.
Yeah, but what about the fact that the association with the word, the name Nigeria is so negative around the world?
I'm coming to that. What I'm saying is that the sentiments that have been built up over the more than a century are going to take a lot of work to remove, negativize, or whatever we call it, in order to bring up a new national identity as simple as a name. So I understand what Ambassador Ojako is saying, that it is a distraction, or it seems like a distraction. But at the same time, I believe that Professor Oyebode's argument is about proper identity of your historic legacy.
Okay.
And that for us to achieve that, it is something to be discussed, not just thrown away, even by rejecting it.
Okay, let's come to you, Professor Akin Oyebode. I take it from listening to your clip there that you are an advocate of restructuring. Political restructuring, fiscal restructuring, and all the other restructurings that are being suggested for Nigeria.
Very much so. I recall that I was heckled at the national conference for my suggestion that we were running a parody of a federal state. And 6 years later, those ideas have not run away. Somebody mentioned Amotekun. Some of you might have watched me discuss the ramifications of a regional setup to complement the efforts of the police. Now it seems the cloud is clearing and we are seeing better, and many other parts of the Federation are thinking of copying the example of Western Nigeria. You see, at the confab, we suggested also, not only myself, but part of the decisions of the confab was possibility of regionalism. In other words, that intending or willing states could come together to form aggregations within the Republic. And quite sincerely, I think most people who study the complications and contradictions of the Nigerian state recognize the necessity to unscramble the egg. You see, we've lived the lie for so long that we are one nation, we are this and that. That's a far cry from the truth. Nigeria, like I think it was the ambassador said, we're a work in progress. And people who have thinking faculties, who have the brain and the intellect, have to interrogate where we are in order to make projections about where we ought to go. This stunted federal system cannot work. I think it's outlived its usefulness. We must go back to the drawing board and reconstitute and rethink and reconfigure the Nigerian state. As I said at the clip you put in, Nigeria has not fully failed, but the house is almost falling. And in order to rescue Nigeria from the catastrophe that awaits it, we have to do urgently necessary things to recreate Nigeria. So the suggestion for name change, as well as a change in the flag, look at the flag that we have. It's an insipid flag. It doesn't inspire anybody. Green, white, green. Like Fela told us, green is another word for dumb. So we don't even have a star. We don't even have any red or black in our flag, despite the fact of the unique position we occupy within the black world. I understand the designer of the flag put a sun in the middle, but that was removed by those who thought they knew best. So apart from the flag and apart from the name, there are other things that we have to do in order to relaunch Nigeria along the path of rapid socioeconomic and political advancement. I think we should not hide behind a finger. We should recognize the necessity, as I said, to reconfigure Nigeria. The name is just something that will no longer apply to the new nation that we are talking about 60 years after our founding fathers accepted the status quo.
Well, that's a very interesting point. And let me bring you in, Ambassador Ojiako, there, because, I mean, to some extent is the point you have been making all along, that with your book. Just remind us of the focus of your book and what you recommend. Because, I mean, part of the problem with restructuring is that it's such a broad area. I mean, people talk about fiscal restructuring, people talk about, political restructuring, all kinds of things. And part of the restructuring is also a name change.
Indeed, I can't agree more with what Professor Everday has said. This is one area where we agree 100%. The issue of those who talk about Nigeria's indivisibility, I don't think God ever created any country. Countries were created by man, and anything made by man is liable to be changed, to be adjusted, to be reset. That dismisses that automatically. I don't think it's worth arguing. As for those who say that restructuring such a humongous thing is so broad, no. If they are honest to themselves and to Nigeria itself, they will agree that what restructuring simply means, simple, devolve certain powers to the federating units. Let the rural people who make up Nigeria, let the different groups who make up Nigeria take certain responsibilities for defining the fate of their lives, where they're going. Everything cannot happen from Abuja. When you take decisions from Abuja on electricity for the entire country, you take decisions on road network for the whole country, and so on, you can see that that's unraveling already. And because it has been going on since the Civil War with the 1960s, and nothing has changed. We keep going around the same circle. The other thing is dividing restructuring into political, economic is again being sophisticated. The real fact is if you devolve powers, giving more responsibilities to the various federating units, it is natural that they should also have the resources which they would generate from their own environment.
It's a natural sort of move. But let me ask you this, just so we don't get away from the object of this discussion. I mean, isn't a modified national identity a real opportunity for Nigerians to decide who they are and how they want to represent themselves to the world? Isn't that the first step?
For me, Charles, if the prize of preserving Nigeria, because I think that restructuring is something that's inevitable if Nigeria is to be preserved. If the prize for preserving the country Nigeria we love is to change its name, change its flag, change its totems and things, so be it. But we should not take away our eyes from the substance.
Okay.
The substance is redefine what the object of Nigeria is. One country, one diverse people, but pursuing the same objective, leading to the same destination.
Let me just bring Lindsay in. We've got, sorry about this, 40 seconds or so before we have to take a break, but we'll come back to you after the break. In terms of international impact, do you think other countries will look at Nigeria as a refreshed nation if it changes its name?
Probably, but I think that should come after the basic changes are made.
So you agree with the ambassador?
I agree with what the ambassador is saying. If the people call for it as a part of the process, then we work on it. But it should be second.
But do you think the people should be given an opportunity to think about it?
Yes, I think we should put the argument out and hear what the new generation says. People like me we're talking on our way out. But what of those coming behind us? Will they like it?
We are assessing calls for Nigeria to be renamed to shed its colonial heritage. Supporters say the country should ditch the name Nigeria, which was given by the colonial governor general Lord Lugard at the suggestion of his girlfriend Flora Shaw, and should instead choose an African name. Some have proposed the country should become Songhai, a name that applied to a state that dominated the Sahel region in West Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries. At its peak, it was one of the largest largest states in African history, but many politicians and ordinary Nigerians have rejected the idea of renaming the country, saying it would not encourage nationalist sentiment or development in Nigeria. So what do people on the streets of Abuja think about possibly changing the name of their country? Take a listen.
National Assembly, they should deliberate on it. Let both the House of Representatives and the Senate, they should work on it and deliberate on it. If all Nigeria want the name to be changed, why not? We can go about and do it. But I don't really feel what is talking about. What they fear when they name in Nigeria is just the area of Niger where the river Niger and River Benue met. That's what they meant. There's no any bad effect on the name Nigeria when being given to us by Flora Shaw or the white men. They are colonizers. But if we want it to change, we're in a democratic world. Let all Nigerians say, make their own opinion known to everybody. House of Reps and the Senate, they can deliberate on it, and then we look for a good name to change this country to.
What we need is cooperation, unity. We will have to forget the religious or any other thing, tribalism. So we have to be ourselves. We are one.
I didn't see anything better for Nigeria to change the name from Nigeria to another name. Because what we are even now, we are even praying and practicing Nigeria to be good, to remain as Nigeria. But I never see something valuable to me, to my understand, to changing from Nigeria to a different name. I believe that Nigeria will be better. That is our prayer.
I don't think it's necessary. That's not a priority right now. I think for the whole restructuring thing, they should work on the economy instead, not the name change. That's not really important. The name is fine. It's really fine. I never knew it came from Niger and area, so I thought it was okay, maybe from River Niger or something. But I don't think it's necessary. I think the name is just fine.
Restructuring has nothing to do with the changing of the name. It's the system. Changing the system, that's just it. Restructuring has nothing to do with the name. Nigeria can be well restructured without changing the name.
Very interesting. With me from our Lagos studios, Dr. Akin Oke Everday, who was a professor of international jurisprudence at the University of Lagos and was a delegate at the 2014 National Conference, where the issue of name change and restructuring were discussed. With me here in the Abuja studio, Ambassador Humphrey Orjiako, retired ambassador and Nigeria's former permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva, who's written a book titled Nigeria, The Forsaken Road to Nationhood and Development, in which he calls for this country to be politically restructured, and the international journalist and African affairs analyst Lindsay Barrett. And let me come to you, Lindsay, because we sort of snatched the words from your mouth there as we had to go on a break. Nigeria has been called the superpower with no power. Does the name have anything to do with that?
I don't think so. In fact, I think I'm an adopted Nigerian. I'm a naturalized citizen. And I worked with the federal government during the Civil War for the simple reason that many of us who considered ourselves Pan-Africanists from the diaspora felt that while we did not condone the atrocities that led to the secession attempt, that the breaking up of the largest conglomeration of black people was not right. And we helped to drive the idea that the Civil War was actually meant to apologize. Maybe part of the problem that we have in this Nigeria is that the apology was not properly formulated after the war was over. But we have to work to fulfill the real dream that people like Dr. Akinori had, which was for a nation of equity. The name then went far. Nigerians, and even today, I don't agree with people who say the name Nigeria carries only negative. Nigeria, when you hear it in Jamaica, where I come from, we still think of Nigerians as these great people who not only look like us, but behave like us. And we believe that the potential the objective of the great Nigeria is achievable. Now, what Professor Everday says raises the issue of how we relate to African history. And the suggestion of Songhai, I can tell you that when we start the argument properly, you may find a lot of arguments against it in Nigeria. Why? Songhai, the old Songhai, was a Sahelian.
Absolutely. And that in itself will bring about its own divisions.
Would bring about divisions.
Oh yeah, why are we getting a name from that part?
But we should have the discussion.
Right.
I think it is a discussion that Nigerians should have. If we eventually reject the name, then the name Nigeria will stand strong.
Okay, well, let me go to Lagos and let's talk to Professor Akin Oke Everday again. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us and being patient. Now, if proponents, Professor, of name change, such as yourself, become more vocal in their call, what legal process, I mean, you're a doctor of jurisprudence, what legal process would they have to follow to effect this change? Presumably the first place would be the National Assembly, beyond obviously the debate in the media and on the streets.
Well, in the context of contemporary Nigeria, we definitely will have to seek the consent of the law-making authority, the National Assembly, for any transition. It was far easier for Cassius Clay to become Muhammad Ali because you are dealing with just one person. But when you have a conglomeration of over 400 ethnic groups, speaking a lingua franca which is alien to us, but who are cohabiting with themselves, then you have to seek the consent of not just the federating units, I would say the constituent parts of Nigeria, because you cannot by fiat change the name, except you have what we call a cultural revolution, the sort of thing that happened in China. And I don't know whether a plebiscite or a referendum can be used. So if we have 50 plus 1% of the electorate voting for it, then it becomes legitimate. But as I said, it's a question of how we want to go about it. There are 1,001 ways of skinning a cat. So if there's a consensus amongst the powers that be, the ruling class, then of course it will require the imprimatur of law in order to put it into being. Okay, I'm just going to jump in there because we've got less than 2 minutes to go, and I'm going to give the last word to Ambassador Ojiako there. All told, Ambassador, does it seem likely that Nigeria will join the list of countries that have changed their names, or is it all going to degenerate into political bickering, as I'm sure you've experienced with the idea of restructuring that you support?
In fact, let us not go about creating a whole new generation of problems, controversies for Nigeria. So if we wish to put content to the prospect of Nigeria being the giant of Africa, that's what many of us are interested in today. That's what I'm writing about. We want to put content to give meaning to Nigeria when it says it's the giant of Africa, and not just a giant with clay feet. Right now we have clay feet. Some people say it's a failing country, some say it has already failed. But I believe that Nigeria could still be resuscitated and made into a strong, united, key federal country. Without that element of federalism, giving people basic freedoms to think for themselves, to do things for themselves, we'll continue to depend on the colonial masters, on China and everybody else, and we'll get nowhere.
Keep pushing that point.
Sure.
Ambassador Ojiako, Lindsay Barrett, and of course Dr. Akin Oke Everday, who joined us from our studios in Lagos. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.